Julia Harper had lost almost everything when her grandfather left her an abandoned 16-room motel. For Julia and her 9-year-old daughter, Maggie, it wasn't just an inheritance. It was finally a place to call home. But on their first night, Maggie noticed something strange. "Mom, there are 17 keys." Julia counted them again. Her daughter was right. 16 rooms, 17 keys, and that extra key was about to uncover a secret her grandfather had kept hidden for 27 years. Stay with me, because what that 17th key opened would change everything Julia believed about the man she loved and trusted. 3 days earlier, Julia Harper had woken before sunrise in the parking lot behind a 24-hour grocery store. For 7 weeks, that had been her routine. Wake before anyone noticed. Fold the blankets. Straighten the back seat. Brush Maggie's hair using the rearview mirror. Then drive her daughter to school and pretend they were just like every other family arriving that morning. Julia was 38 years old. She had spent most of her adult life caring for other people, first as a wife, then as a mother, and later as a caregiver for elderly residents at a small assisted living facility. She had never been wealthy, but she had always managed until the marriage ended. Then her work hours were cut. The bills didn't care that she was trying. Neither did the rent. Little by little, everything Julia had spent years building disappeared. The apartment went last. Maggie was 9, old enough to notice when something was wrong, but young enough that Julia still hoped she could protect her from the worst of it. So Julia called sleeping in the Honda their little adventure. Maggie played along. That hurt more than if she'd complained. Some nights Julia would wait until her daughter was asleep, then sit behind the steering wheel listening to her breathe. She wasn't asking life for much anymore. Just a locked door, a warm bed, a place where Maggie could leave her shoes beside the bed and know they'd still be there the next morning. Then the call came. Her grandfather, Edward Harper, had died. Julia hadn't seen him often in recent years, but some of her safest childhood memories belonged to him. Summers at Cedar Hollow, the smell of coffee behind the front desk, Edward fixing a broken screen door while an old radio played nearby, and one sentence he used to repeat whenever a tired traveler arrived late at night. Nobody should leave Cedar Hollow hungry or without a place to sleep. Now Cedar Hollow belonged to Julia. The motel sat outside Pine Hollow, Washington, where the highway narrowed between tall evergreens and the mountains seemed to hold the town apart from the rest of the world. Time had not been kind to it. The sign leaned toward the road. Moss covered part of the roof. Weeds pushed through cracks in the parking lot. The 16 guest rooms stood in 2 faded rows beneath a sagging wooden walkway. Julia parked and turned off the engine. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Maggie looked through the windshield. "Is this ours?" Julia stared at the old motel. She didn't know how much it was worth. She didn't know whether the plumbing worked or whether the roof would survive another winter. And she certainly didn't know what Edward had left behind inside it. But she knew one thing. Tonight, her daughter wouldn't have to sleep in the back seat. Julia reached over and squeezed Maggie's hand. "For now," she said softly, "this is home." Maggie smiled. And for the first time in 7 weeks, Julia smiled too. She had come to Cedar Hollow believing it was simply an old motel she could sell. She had no idea that before long, this forgotten place would force her to choose between protecting the only home her daughter had left and uncovering a truth her own family had buried for decades. The next morning, Cedar Hollow looked less frightening in daylight. Still tired, still forgotten, but not hopeless. Julia found an old broom behind the office and spent most of the morning sweeping leaves from the walkway while Maggie explored nearby, carrying a notebook she'd found beneath the front desk. Every few minutes, she returned with another discovery. An old postcard, a rusted service bell, A faded photograph of the motel when its sign still glowed red at night. For the first time in weeks, Julia heard her daughter laugh without forcing it. She stopped sweeping just to listen. Maybe, she thought, they could stay here for a little while. Maybe she could clean a few rooms, get the utilities working, and sell the property without rushing. Maybe Cedar Hollow could give them enough time to breathe. Then Maggie appeared at the office door holding the old motel map. "Mom." Julia smiled. "What did you find now?" Maggie laid the map across the counter. "There's no room 9. Julia looked down. She remembered noticing it the night before, but exhaustion had pushed it aside. The rooms along the west wing were numbered 6, 7, 8, then 10. Julia frowned. Maybe Grandpa skipped a number. Why? I don't know. Hotels do strange things sometimes. Maggie considered that. Then she pointed outside. But wouldn't room 8 still be next to room 10? Julia looked at her daughter. "What do you mean?" Maggie took her hand. "Come on." They walked down the west wing. Room 6. Room 7. Room 8. Then room 10. Maggie stood between the last 2 doors and stretched out her arms. "Look." Julia did. There was too much wall between them. Not a few inches. Several feet. Enough space for another room. Julia stepped back toward the parking lot. From outside, the motel looked continuous. Nothing about the roofline suggested a missing section. But Maggie was right. Something was there. Or had been. Julia returned to the office and took the 17th key from the board. The unmarked one. She told herself there was probably a reasonable explanation. An old storage room. A maintenance closet. Maybe Edward had remodeled the motel years ago and simply never updated the floor plan. Ordinary explanations. Julia needed ordinary explanations. She had enough uncertainty in her life already. Back outside, she and Maggie examined the wall between rooms 8 and 10. Thick ivy covered most of it. Julia pulled at the vines. Dry leaves scattered across her shoes. Behind them was weathered siding. Then Maggie saw something. Wait. She crouched and brushed away another cluster of vines. A metal hinge appeared. Julia's stomach tightened. Together, they pulled harder. Years of growth came loose until the outline became unmistakable. A door. Narrow. Painted the same faded gray as the wall. No room number. No window. Just an old brass lock. Maggie looked at Julia's hand. At the key. Neither of them spoke. Julia slid it into the lock. It fit. For a moment, she didn't turn it. She thought of Edward. Of summers spent running along this very walkway. Of all the times she'd passed this wall as a child without knowing a door was there. Then she turned the key. The lock clicked. Maggie moved closer. Julia opened the door. The smell came first. Dust. Old wood. Air that seemed to have been trapped for years. Julia found a switch. Nothing happened. Using the flashlight on her phone, she stepped inside. "Maggie, stay behind me." The room was small but unmistakably a guest room. A narrow bed stood against one wall. An old brown coat hung from a hook. A suitcase rested beneath a wooden chair. On the nightstand sat a water glass clouded with dust. It didn't look abandoned. It looked interrupted. As if someone had walked out expecting to return. Maggie whispered. Whose room was this? Julia didn't answer. Near the bed was a small writing desk. She pulled open the top drawer. Inside was an old motel registration card. The paper had yellowed around the edges. Julia lifted it carefully. Daniel Mercer. The check-in date was from 27 years earlier. Below it was a space marked, "Check out." Blank. Julia stared at it. Something about that empty line made the room feel colder. Then Maggie pointed toward the back of the drawer. "What's that?" A cassette tape. Julia picked it up. Someone had written 4 words across the label in black ink. Please let them know. Julia felt Maggie press against her side. Back in the office, they found an old cassette player beneath a stack of telephone directories. Julia cleaned the battery contacts, found 2 batteries in a drawer, and pressed play. Static filled the room. Then a man's voice emerged. Tired. Low. Afraid. My name is Daniel Mercer. Julia stopped breathing. If someone is hearing this, I may not have gotten out of Pine Hollow. Maggie reached for her mother's hand. Daniel spoke about land purchases. Families pressured into selling. Payments that never appeared in public records. Meetings held after dark. Then his voice became quieter. There are people here who know what they're doing, and there are people helping them because they're afraid to say no. A pause. Tape hiss. Julia leaned closer. Then Daniel said, Richard Caldwell knows I'm asking questions. Another pause. And Edward Harper knows why. Julia's hand went still. Maggie looked up. Mom! But Julia couldn't answer. She simply stared at the cassette player. Because Edward Harper wasn't just the man who had left her Cedar Hollow. He was the man who had taught her that a person's word mattered. The man whose motel had just given her daughter a bed when they had nowhere else to go. And now, from a room that wasn't supposed to exist, the voice of a man missing for 27 years had spoken her grandfather's name. Julia played the tape 3 times. Each time, she hoped she'd heard it wrong. She hadn't. And Edward Harper knows why. Her grandfather's name came through the old speaker beneath a layer of static. But there was no mistaking it. Maggie sat quietly beside her. Was Grandpa Edward a bad person? The question hurt more than Julia expected. She looked at her daughter. I don't know, sweetheart. It was the first time Julia could remember saying those words about him. That afternoon, she returned to room 9 alone. She told Maggie to stay in the office with the door locked. Then Julia searched everything. The suitcase. The desk. The mattress. Even the loose boards beneath the window. Behind one of them, she found a brown envelope. Inside were photocopied land records, canceled checks, handwritten notes, and photographs of men standing outside buildings Julia didn't recognize. One name appeared again and again. Richard Caldwell. Then she found another. Edward Harper. Julia stared at her grandfather's signature beneath a payment receipt. The amount wasn't enormous, but it was enough. Enough to prove Edward hadn't simply overheard something. He had been involved. Julia sat on the edge of the dusty bed. For most of her childhood, Edward Harper had been the safest man she knew. He taught her how to change a tire, how to bait a fishing hook, how to apologize without adding the word but. And now she was sitting inside a room he'd hidden for 27 years, holding evidence that seemed to contradict everything he'd taught her. She almost wished she had never found the key. Almost. Then she heard tires on gravel. Julia froze. A dark sedan had stopped near the entrance to Cedar Hollow. The engine remained running. No one got out. Julia stepped behind the curtain. The windshield reflected the afternoon light, hiding whoever was inside. Then she remembered Maggie. Julia ran. She crossed the walkway and hurried into the office. Maggie was sitting behind the desk, drawing. Mom? Julia locked the door. Come away from the window. Why? Just come here. Maggie obeyed. Julia pulled her close and watched through a narrow gap in the blinds. The sedan stayed there for nearly 4 minutes. Then it slowly backed onto the highway and disappeared. Julia told herself it could have been anyone. A lost driver. Someone looking at the property. Someone who had stopped to make a phone call. But she didn't believe any of those explanations. That night, Julia barely slept. She pushed a chair beneath the doorknob and kept her phone beside her pillow. Maggie slept peacefully. Julia watched the ceiling. Every sound seemed louder. The wind against the siding, branches scraping the roof, a truck passing on the highway. At 2:17, headlights swept across the curtains. Julia sat up immediately. They passed. She didn't sleep again. The next morning, Maggie opened the door before Julia could stop her. There was an envelope on the ground. No stamp, no address, just Julia's name. "Mom, someone left this." Julia took it from her. Inside was a single sheet of paper, one sentence. "You finally have a roof over your daughter's head. Don't lose it." Julia read it twice, then a third time. Her hands began to shake. They knew about Maggie. They knew Julia had been homeless. They knew Cedar Hollow wasn't simply property to her. It was leverage. Within 20 minutes, Julia was packing. She didn't care what room 9 contained anymore. She didn't care what Edward had done. She wanted Maggie safe. Suitcases went into the trunk. Blankets followed. Then, the little blue pillow Maggie had slept on during those 7 weeks in the Honda. Julia placed it on the back seat. When she turned around, Maggie was standing behind her. The little girl looked at the pillow, then at the packed car. Her face changed. "Mom?" Julia forced a smile. "We're just going somewhere else for a while." Maggie didn't move. "Are we sleeping in the car again?" 6 words. That was all it took. Julia looked at the back seat, at the blanket she'd folded every morning before sunrise, at the place where her daughter had curled herself into a space too small for a growing child. For 7 weeks, Julia had told herself Maggie didn't understand, that she'd protected her. But standing there, Julia suddenly wasn't so sure. She looked back at Cedar Hollow. The peeling paint, the crooked sign, the motel she'd planned to sell the moment she arrived. 2 days ago, it had looked like a burden. Now it was the only roof her daughter had. Julia faced an impossible choice. Stay, and risk whoever had left that warning coming back. Leave, and take Maggie straight back to the life she'd been desperately trying to escape. Then Julia noticed something beneath the windshield wiper. Another piece of paper, not a threat this time. A photocopy. She pulled it free. It was one of the land records she'd found inside room 9. Julia's blood went cold. At the bottom, someone had circled Edward Harper's signature in red ink, and beneath it, 3 words had been written by hand. "Ask why he lied." Julia slowly looked toward the empty highway. Whoever was watching Cedar Hollow didn't just know she'd opened room 9. They knew exactly what she'd found inside. And for the first time, Julia understood something far more frightening. The secret buried in that motel wasn't dead. Someone was still protecting it. Julia didn't leave Cedar Hollow that morning. But she didn't unpack the car either. For nearly an hour, the suitcases remained in the trunk while Maggie sat on the office steps eating crackers from a paper cup. Julia kept looking at the highway, waiting for the dark sedan, waiting for another warning. Nothing came. Finally, she looked down at the photocopy in her hand. Ask why he lied. Maybe whoever left it wanted to frighten her. Maybe they wanted her angry at Edward. Or maybe they wanted her to find something. Julia no longer knew which possibility frightened her more. She went back inside the office. Edward's old desk still stood beneath the window. As a child, Julia had watched him sit there balancing receipts with a pencil behind his ear and a cup of coffee growing cold beside him. She remembered climbing onto his lap while he worked. She remembered feeling safe there. Now she began opening every drawer. Nothing. Then she noticed scratches along the floor beneath the desk. Julia pushed it aside. One floorboard was darker than the others. She pried it loose. Underneath was a small metal box. Locked. Julia almost laughed. Another lock. Another secret. She searched Edward's desk until she found a tiny key taped beneath the bottom drawer. Inside the box were no deeds, no money, no explanation that could magically make everything right. There were letters, dozens of them, all addressed to the same man, Daniel Mercer. None had been mailed. Julia opened the oldest. Edward's handwriting was unmistakable. At first, she read quickly, then more slowly. By the third letter, she had to sit down. Edward had known about the land deal. He had allowed Richard Caldwell and several investors to meet privately at Cedar Hollow after hours. He had signed documents, and he had taken money. Julia closed her eyes. Some part of her had still been hoping for innocence. There wasn't any. Her grandfather had participated, but the letters continued. Edward wrote that Caldwell had described the arrangement as harmless old properties bought from owners who were ready to sell anyway. Then Daniel started asking questions. Families had been pressured. Some had been misled about what their land was worth. Public information had been kept from them while people with connections quietly positioned themselves to profit. Daniel knew, and eventually, so did Edward. One letter had been written shortly after Daniel disappeared. The handwriting shook across the page. Daniel, I told myself I was protecting my family, the motel, my daughter, everything I'd worked for. But fear doesn't become courage just because a man calls it protection. Julia stopped reading. For a long time, the only sound in the office was the old wall clock. Tick, tick, tick. She remembered Edward teaching her to tell the truth even when it cost something. Now she understood why he had said it so often. Maybe some lessons aren't born from wisdom. Maybe they're born from regret. Maggie appeared quietly in the doorway. Mom? Julia wiped her face. Hey, sweetheart. Are you crying? A little. Maggie came over and leaned against her. Julia wrapped an arm around her daughter. Was Grandpa Edward bad? There was that question again. This time, Julia didn't answer quickly. No, she finally said. Then she shook her head. That's not quite right. Maggie waited. He did something wrong. Something very wrong. And when he had a chance to tell the truth, he got scared. Did he say sorry? Julia looked at the letters. He tried to. Did it fix it? Julia felt something inside her break open. Children had a way of finding the question adults spent years avoiding. No, she whispered. It didn't. Maggie thought about that. Then why did he keep writing? Julia looked at the box, at decades of apologies addressed to a man who would never read them. I think because he didn't want to forget what he'd done. That afternoon, Julia read every letter. Edward never asked Daniel to forgive him. That mattered. He never claimed he was innocent. That mattered too. Again and again, he wrote about going to the police, going to a newspaper, telling Julia's mother. Then fear stopped him. Years passed. Caldwell became wealthier. Daniel remained missing. And Edward grew older. Julia had spent the previous night wondering whether the grandfather she loved had been a lie. Now she understood something harder. He hadn't been. The man who taught her kindness was real. So was the man who accepted the money. The grandfather who gave stranded travelers free rooms was real. So was the frightened motel owner who stayed silent when another man needed him to speak. Both were Edward Harper. And Julia realized she didn't have to choose between loving him and telling the truth about him. She could do both. Near the bottom of the box was one final envelope. Unlike the others, it wasn't addressed to Daniel. On the front, in Edward's fading handwriting, were 2 words. For Julia, her fingers tightened around it. She almost opened it. Then she stopped. Something told her this letter was different. Whatever Edward had left for her, she wasn't ready yet. Julia placed it back in the box. Then she looked toward Maggie. For 2 days, Julia had been asking herself what kind of man her grandfather really was. Now she had a different question. What kind of woman would she choose to be? Knowing the truth, he had been too afraid to tell. Julia didn't open Edward's final letter. Not yet. She placed it back inside the metal box and carried everything into room 9. The letters, the land records, the photographs, Daniel's cassette. For the first time since arriving at Cedar Hollow, Julia stopped thinking about selling the motel. She stopped thinking about what the property might be worth. She thought about Daniel Mercer, 27 years. 27 Christmases his family had lived without answers. 27 birthdays. 27 years of wondering whether he'd left them willingly. Julia looked at Maggie sitting cross-legged on the floor, coloring beneath the window. Edward had spent nearly 3 decades waiting for courage to arrive. Julia understood now that courage didn't work that way. Sometimes you acted while you were still afraid. She took out her phone. Then she photographed everything. Every page. Every signature. Every check. Every letter. She uploaded copies to 3 separate accounts and sent another set to an old friend in Seattle. If someone came back to Cedar Hollow, destroying room 9 would no longer destroy the truth. Then Julia made a call. Frank Holloway answered on the 4th ring. He was 68, a longtime reporter for the Pine Hollow Gazette, and his voice carried the weary caution of a man who had spent decades hearing stories people swore were true. Julia told him she had information about Daniel Mercer. Silence. Then Frank said, "Don't say anything else over the phone." He arrived 40 minutes later. Gray hair, weathered face, an old canvas reporter's bag hanging from one shoulder. When Julia showed him Daniel's registration card, Frank stopped speaking. "You knew him?" Julia asked. Frank nodded. "Everybody in the newspaper business around here knew Daniel." He picked up the cassette. "Some of us thought he ran. His family thought that too." Frank looked at her. "Some people wanted us to think that." For the next 2 hours, Julia showed him everything. When Frank reached Edward's signature, he removed his glasses. "Your grandfather was part of this." "I know. You understand what happens if I publish that." Julia did. Edward's name would be damaged. Maybe permanently. People would talk. Some would call him corrupt. Others would call Julia disloyal for exposing her own family. For a moment, she remembered the man who used to make pancakes for her on Sunday mornings. The man who taught her to fish. The man who had given her and Maggie the only roof they had. Then she remembered his letter. Fear doesn't become courage just because a man calls it protection. "Don't protect him," Julia said. Frank studied her. "You're sure?" "No." That surprised him. Julia looked toward Maggie. "But I'm sure the truth matters more." Frank nodded slowly. Then he noticed the name Richard Caldwell. His expression changed. "You've heard of him?" Julia asked. Frank gave a humorless laugh. "Everyone in Pine Hollow has—" Caldwell was 76 now. Retired from practicing law, but hardly powerless. His family still owned commercial property throughout the county, including land connected to a development project worth millions. Frank spread the old maps across the desk. Then he pointed. "These parcels Daniel was investigating." Julia nodded. "Some of them are part of that development today." Julia understood. The secret wasn't only about something terrible that happened 27 years ago. It still had value. And exposing it could still cost someone money. "The car," Julia whispered. "What car?" She told him. Then she showed him the threat. Frank read it twice. "You and your daughter shouldn't be alone here." Julia's stomach tightened. "Should I leave?" Frank looked around Cedar Hollow, then at the evidence. "That's your decision. But if somebody thinks frightening you will make this disappear, we make sure it can't disappear." That afternoon, Frank made calls. Julia sent copies to his editor, then to an attorney, then to county investigators. By sunset, the secret Edward had hidden inside one room existed in too many places to bury again. For the first time, Julia felt something stronger than fear. Not safety. Not yet. But possibility. 3 days later, the story ran. Missing reporters' files discovered in sealed Cedar Hollow motel room. Daniel Mercer's name was printed beneath it. So was Edward Harper's. So was Richard Caldwell's. Julia stared at the article for a long time. Her grandfather's reputation was no longer hers to protect. Daniel's story was no longer hers to carry alone. The truth belonged to everyone now. The next morning, Julia heard a vehicle pull into the parking lot. Her body tensed. But it wasn't the dark sedan. It was an old pickup truck. A thin man stepped out slowly. He looked to be in his 70s. In his hands was a battered file box. "My name is Arthur Prescott," he said. "I used to work for the city." Julia didn't answer. Arthur looked toward room 9, then back at her. "I read the article." His eyes filled with something Julia recognized immediately. Shame. "I've been waiting 27 years for somebody else to go first." He placed the box on the hood of Julia's Honda. "I think these belong with what you found." Julia opened it. Inside were original city records, meeting notes, property assessments, documents Daniel Mercer had been trying to find before he disappeared. Arthur lowered his eyes. "Your grandfather wasn't the only coward in Pine Hollow." Julia looked at the box, then at the old man standing before her. Something had changed. Opening room 9 hadn't only uncovered Edward's failure, it had opened a door for everyone else who had been afraid. And one by one, they were beginning to walk through it. The days after Frank's article changed Cedar Hollow. Not all at once. There were no television trucks filling the parking lot, no dramatic arrests, no sudden ending that tied 27 years of pain into a neat little bow. Real life rarely worked that way. Instead, people began to come. The first was an elderly woman named Eleanor Hayes. She arrived carrying a faded photograph of her parents standing in front of a farmhouse. "My father sold 80 acres for almost nothing," she told Julia. "He thought the county was going to condemn it." She looked down at the photograph. 6 months later, developers bought the land next door for 5 times what he got. Eleanor was followed by others. A retired mechanic, a widow whose husband had died believing he'd made the worst financial decision of his life, a man who remembered Daniel Mercer knocking on his parents' door and asking questions no one wanted to answer. They didn't come because Julia had all the answers. They came because, after 27 years, someone had finally opened the door. Julia listened. That surprised her. A week earlier, she'd been measuring Cedar Hollow by what it could give her. A roof, a bed for Maggie, money if she sold it. Now she began seeing the motel differently. Maybe its value wasn't in what she could get from it. Maybe it was in what could happen there. Then one afternoon, a silver sedan pulled into the parking lot. Julia's body tightened automatically. An older woman stepped out. She was small, perhaps 72, with silver hair pinned loosely behind her head. She stood beside the car for a long moment before approaching. "Are you Julia Harper?" "Yes." The woman nodded. "My name is Margaret Mercer." Julia felt the air leave her lungs. Daniel's younger sister. Margaret looked toward the west wing. "Is it still there?" Julia knew exactly what she meant. "Yes." "Could I see it?" Julia hesitated. Then she opened room 9. Margaret stepped inside alone. She touched the back of the wooden chair, the old suitcase, Daniel's coat. Then she saw the registration card. Her brother's name? "For 27 years, Margaret explained, her family had believed Daniel chose to disappear. Their mother waited by the telephone for years. Their father drove through neighboring towns looking for him. Eventually, hope became anger. Then anger became something worse. Acceptance. My mother died believing her son didn't love her enough to come home. Julia's eyes filled. I'm so sorry. Margaret shook her head. You didn't do this. I know, but my grandfather. Your grandfather made his choices. Margaret looked at her. And you're making yours. For a while, neither woman spoke. Then Margaret picked up Daniel's old coat and pressed the sleeve between her fingers. You can't give us those years back, she said. Julia lowered her eyes. I wish I could. Margaret's voice softened. You can't? She looked at her brother's belongings. But you gave us him back. Julia never forgot those words. Not justice. Not closure. Daniel was still gone. Edward's regret couldn't bring him back. No newspaper article could return 27 lost years to his family. But truth could return something. A name. A memory. A person's dignity. That evening, Julia sat outside Cedar Hollow while Maggie drew with chalk on the cracked pavement. For weeks, Julia had thought of herself as a woman whose life had fallen apart. Abandoned wife. Struggling mother. Homeless. $43 left. Those facts were still true. But they were no longer the whole truth. Maggie suddenly looked up. Mom. Yeah. Are we still going to sell this place? Julia looked at Cedar Hollow. At the broken sign. At the peeling paint. At room 9. She thought of Eleanor. Arthur. Margaret. Daniel. And Edward. No, Julia said. Maggie's face brightened. We're keeping it. I think so. Maggie ran over and wrapped both arms around her. For a moment, Julia simply held her. Then Maggie whispered, Can we make it pretty again? Julia laughed through tears. We can try. And they did. They started small. 1 gallon of paint. A repaired window. Flowers planted in old coffee cans because Julia couldn't afford flower pots. Frank brought lumber. Arthur came one Saturday with tools. Eleanor donated curtains she'd kept boxed in her attic. People who had arrived carrying painful memories began returning with paintbrushes. Cedar Hollow slowly changed. So did Julia. She had spent months believing that accepting help meant she'd failed. Now she understood something she wished she'd learned years earlier. Sometimes strength wasn't carrying everything alone. Sometimes strength was letting someone carry one end. But there was one thing Julia still hadn't done. Edward's final letter remained inside the metal box. For Julia, one evening, after Maggie had fallen asleep, Julia took it out. She sat behind the same front desk where Edward had once balanced receipts and poured coffee for strangers. Her thumb slipped beneath the envelope flap. Then she stopped. Behind the old keyboard, Julia noticed something she had never seen before. A narrow gap between the wood and the wall. She removed the board. Something fell to the floor. Another envelope. Older than the first. On the front was her name. And beneath it, in Edward's handwriting, were 6 words. If you found the 17th key. Julia stared at them. Then she turned the envelope over. Whatever her grandfather had been unable to say while he was alive, he had left for her to discover after he was gone. Julia sat alone behind the front desk for nearly 10 minutes before opening the envelope. Outside, Cedar Hollow had gone quiet. The newly painted sign creaked gently in the wind. Somewhere down the hall, Maggie was asleep in the same room where, weeks earlier, she had asked if they were allowed to stay another night. Julia looked at Edward's handwriting. If you found the 17th key. Then she unfolded the letter. Julia, if you're reading this, then you found the room. Julia stopped. For a moment, she could almost hear her grandfather's voice. She continued. Edward wrote that he'd spent years convincing himself there would eventually be a right time to tell the truth. After Christmas, after the motel had a better year, after Julia's mother was settled, after Caldwell lost his influence, after he became less afraid, but the right time never came. Fear, Edward wrote, was clever that way. It always promised courage tomorrow. And then it stole another day. Julia wiped her eyes. The next lines were harder. I won't ask you to forgive me. Some things shouldn't be made smaller just because the person who did them is sorry. Julia covered her mouth. Edward knew what he'd done. He hadn't left her a letter asking to be remembered as a good man. He hadn't asked her to protect the Harper name. He had asked for something much more difficult. The truth. Edward explained that he'd kept room 9 sealed because he couldn't bring himself to destroy Daniel's evidence. Every year, he considered opening it. Every year, he failed. So he kept the room, kept the cassette, kept the 17th key. And when his health began to fail, he made one final decision. He left Cedar Hollow to Julia. You were always braver than you knew, he wrote. Even as a little girl, you asked questions when adults wanted you to be quiet. Then came the final line. Julia read it once. Then again, if you found the key, I've only one thing left to ask of you. Be braver than I was. Julia lowered the letter and cried. Not because Edward was innocent. He wasn't. Not because his letter erased what he'd done. It couldn't. She cried because, for the first time, she understood the inheritance he'd truly left her. Cedar Hollow wasn't an apology. The 17th key wasn't a gift. They were a responsibility. Edward had left Julia the truth because he'd run out of time to become the man he wished he'd been. And somehow, he had believed his granddaughter might have the courage to finish what he couldn't. The next morning, Julia took Maggie to room 9. Sunlight entered through the window now. The dust was gone. Daniel's belongings had been carefully preserved, and on one wall Julia had placed copies of the documents that told what happened. She had made a decision. Room 9 would stay, not as a tourist attraction, not as something frightening, as a place to remember. Over the following months, Cedar Hollow slowly came back to life. Julia repaired 6 rooms first, then 8. Travelers began stopping again. Some had read about Daniel Mercer. Others knew nothing about the story. They simply needed a clean bed and somewhere warm to spend the night. Julia kept Edward's old coffee pot behind the desk. And whenever someone arrived late, exhausted and short on money, she remembered what her grandfather used to say. Nobody should leave Cedar Hollow hungry or without a place to sleep. So sometimes Julia charged less. Sometimes she charged nothing. She understood now that Edward's kindness had been real. So had his cowardice. People were complicated enough to carry both. Julia didn't need to turn him into a hero to keep loving him. And she didn't need to hate him to tell the truth. Nearly a year after Julia first arrived, Margaret Mercer returned. This time she wasn't alone. She brought Daniel's niece and 2 grandchildren he had never lived long enough to meet. They stood together inside room 9. Margaret placed a framed photograph of Daniel on the desk. He was smiling in it. Young. Alive. Before Pine Hollow. Before the investigation. Before his name became a mystery. Margaret touched the frame. Then she looked at Julia. He has a room now. Julia swallowed. He always did. Margaret smiled sadly. No. She shook her head. I mean, he has a place in the world again. That evening, Julia stood outside Cedar Hollow as the sun disappeared behind the pines. The motel wasn't beautiful. Not yet. There were still boards that needed replacing. Bills that worried her. Rooms she couldn't afford to repair. Her life hadn't magically become easy. But Maggie was inside doing homework at the front desk. There was food in the refrigerator. There were flowers beside the walkway. And for the first time in a very long time, Julia wasn't wondering where they would sleep tomorrow. She reached into her pocket. The 17th key was still there. Once, it had opened a room filled with everything her family wanted forgotten. Now Julia understood that some doors aren't open so we can live in the past. They're opened so the past no longer controls the future. She looked through the office window at Maggie and smiled. Julia thought she'd inherited an abandoned motel. What Edward had really left her was a choice. Hide what hurt, or open the door. He had spent 27 years choosing fear. Julia chose differently. And because she did, a missing man got his name back. A frightened town began telling the truth. An old motel became a home again. And a woman who once believed she'd lost everything finally understood. Sometimes the life that falls apart isn't the end of your story. Sometimes it's where the door to the next one begins. A few days later, Julia found a small notebook beneath Maggie's pillow. A folded page slipped onto the floor. On it was a drawing of their old Honda beneath a row of stars. Underneath, Maggie had written, "Mom thinks I didn't know we were homeless." Julia's breath caught. Then she read the next line. "I knew. I just pretended it was an adventure because Mom looked sad when she thought I was asleep." Julia sat down and cried. For 7 weeks, she'd believed she was protecting Maggie. She never realized Maggie had been protecting her, too. That evening, Julia found her daughter doing homework behind the front desk. She took a small brass key from the drawer and placed it in Maggie's hand. Maggie looked up. "What's this?" "Your key." "To what?" Julia smiled through her tears. "Home." She gently closed Maggie's fingers around it.